In this video, we're going to talk about Python functions. First, let's just review what we know about functions in math. So in math, you have a function if you have a relation, which is a thing that has inputs and has outputs, where you're guaranteed one and only one possible output for a given input. And functions in code are slightly different, but they are patterned after functions in math. But in Python specifically, and most coding languages, this is what functions are. You're going to have a block of code, and even though it's in your source, you've got it all written right there, and the interpreter will read it, it's not going to actually run it unless there's another line of code that calls it. And you call it simply in Python by giving the name of the function. And you can pass data into the function, and you can also return data based on what the function is doing. And you don't have to, though. You can have functions with no inputs and no outputs, and we'll look at some examples of those. Here's an example where I've got a function that doesn't have any input or any output. And let's just look down here what it's doing. I define a function by using the keyword def, and you want to define the function before you actually call it, because the interpreter needs to know that it's in there. So the interpreter goes along, it sees the word def, then it looks for the next thing, which is the name, and in the parentheses are where you would provide the inputs to the particular function. Now in this case, I don't have any inputs, so you still have to have parentheses, they're just going to be empty, and then it was going to print this hello world statement. So any statements you want can be in there. Now there is no output, so it just is going to do this thing and that's it. Now when it's running, right, when you execute your source, the interpreter just takes note of this, but it doesn't really do anything with it yet until we come along later in the code. And I have a little note here to notice that this statement that is calling it is indented all the way back to the left. So if you look up here, how do I know where my function code is and when it ends? It's when the indents stop. So it's indented, so this print statement goes with this definition of the hello function. But when I'm calling it here, I'm using the word hello, it's indented all the way back again, so it's not part of this hello function. And you just call it, just use its name, hello. And what the interpreter does, again, so it comes through, it decides, oh look, there's some function called hello, and here's what it does. Okay, it's not going to do it yet. And then it sees somebody saying, hey, use this function. It's using its name. And at that point, the interpreter says, okay, everybody here, halt. I'm going up here. I'm going to do whatever this thing says to do. And then when I'm done doing it, I return back to this statement, and then I continue on. If you're used to something like Scratch, where they have these broadcast receive capabilities, unless you specify otherwise, they would go at the same time, right? You broadcast and you continue going, and the thing that you broadcast to is also running. But these run one right after the other, not at the same time. Here's an example where I want to pass something into my function. I want to pass a value in. It has an input. So just like before, I still have my def, and it's def hello. This time, though, I have a calling parameter called name. And it's just a variable in Python. And then we can see that inside the actual function, I would be using it. I'm going to concatenate that name to the string. But you can do other things with your input parameters. But again, once I'm running the first time through, it's just noticing this. It's taking note. I do have this function. Nothing gets executed or run yet. And then later on in the code, again, indented back, so it's not part of the hello definition. I have my hello function, but this time I'm passing in a value. And I'm putting a literal value here. It could be a variable that has a value, but it basically says, hey, run the hello function. And instead of name, you're going to use this value for name. This is Grieser. So it's going to use this value in here. So even though they look different, when you run this thing, it's taking the place. So Mrs. Grieser gets passed in here, and now this variable name that the function is using will have that same value, and it knows what to print. You can have multiple inputs, and you can also have an output. So here's an example of that. In my function definition here, my sum function, I'm passing in 3 inputs, A, B, and C, those 3 variables. And here's something new. If you want to give something back from the function, you use a return statement. And in this case, there is only one thing being returned. And it looks like there's 3 variables here, but I'm adding them all together. So it's going to add them all together, and it's going to return what that sum is. And later on, when I actually call this function, I have to have a variable here to sort of receive what that thing is returning. So I've created one called total. Then I use that keyword sum, so it knows to use this function. And now I'm passing in actual values, a 1, a 2, and a 3. You could use different variables that have settings, but in this case, I'm just using kind of literal replacements there. And then when it calls sum, it knows, hey, the place where it says A, use a 1. And the place where it says B, use this 2. And the place where it says 3. So it's going to return the sum of these three numbers. So if you were to print out what total is, you would get 6, because 1 plus 2 plus 3 is 6. I believe I have one more example here. You can actually have multiple outputs with Python functions. I've got a function here that I'm defining called sum and product. So still taking 3 inputs, but I'm actually returning 2 things. And even though it looks like there's 6 variables here, and there are 6 variables, there's only 2 values that go back, and there's a comma in between them. So the first return value that you get is the sum A plus B plus C. It's going to add those together. And then the second one that you get is the product, where you multiply those 3 values. So when you come along here and you call the sum and product function, you have to have 2 variables that are going to receive those outputs, because this function returns 2 things. So I have a variable total, which is going to hold the first one. So the order that you put these matters. And then I have another one called product, which will receive the second one. So sum and product of 2, 3, 4. Well, total will get the sum of those things, which is 9. And product will get the product of them, which is 24. So when I print it out, that's what I should see. And I highly suggest you just try these, run these little snippets just to get a really good idea of what they're doing. But that's basically very short little description of how functions work. Big ideas here are you need the def keyword first to define your functions, and you define them before you use them. And it's the indents, just like in if statements or loops, that tell you, where your functions begin and end. And there is a colon after your def statement, so don't forget that thing. I do have a challenge for those of you who are my students, and even if you're not. So I want you to make a little Magic 8-Ball program in Codesters, or you can use any Python environment you like. And that's a little fortune teller game. If you don't know what Magic 8-Ball is, it's been around for many, many years. So you basically ask this thing a yes or no question, and then you shake it up. And then in the real world, this is a real product, you would turn it upside down, and it gives you an answer to your yes or no question. It's very scientific. But for my students, I have the HyperDoc with a link to a video and a Wikipedia article on Magic 8-Ball if you want to see more about what that thing is. What I want you to do is I want you to create a Codesters project outside of the Codesters lesson path, so your own project, that simulates a Magic 8-Ball. And if you're watching this and you're not one of my students, just do this in any environment that you want. I would like you to use at least one list and at least one function in here. And so what I've done for my students is if you're having a little trouble getting started, I do have a little skeleton project available where the format and structure is all there, but you just kind of fill in the in-between. You can also look at an example that I have done. And so if you're my student, you have a copy of these charts and you can just click on those links to see it. And so this is kind of an optional assignment, but I think you should try it if you can. I think you'll have a lot of fun with it. And that's kind of all I have to say about lists right now. Thank you for watching.